Mr. President.
The Democratic leader.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, today, we drink and yet they were unable to keep the government open for the American people. Leader McConnell knows it takes 60 votes to win passage of a spending bill, and yet he moved forward with a last-minute extension that he knew lacked the votes. Both Democrats and Republicans voted against that bill. Each would have averted this shutdown. Each would have led to a deal on the budget and health care and disaster aid and things like opioids and veterans and pensions and on immigration. My recent offer to the President was a generous one. I put his signature campaign the Senate on where things stand after this weekend. Since our meeting in the Oval Office on Friday, the President and I have not spoken. And after several discussions, offers, counteroffers, the Republican leader and I have come to an arrangement. We will vote today be neutral and fair to all sides. We expect that a bipartisan bill on DACA will receive fair consideration and an up or down vote on the floor. Now, it's a shame, Mr. President, that the American people and the Senate have had to endure such hand-wringing, finger-pointing stridency to secure a guarantee that we will finally move to address this urgent issue. It is something the majority could have avoided entirely, a concern the President could have obviated if he were only willing to take yes. And through the Senate. It is a good solution, and I will vote for it. I'm incredibly grateful to the bipartisan group should be on the issue of immigration, a place for bipartisanship, a place for action, a place for achievement. With the minority and the moderate middle empowered to bring a bill to the floor instead of being held by the most strident anti-immigration voices in the Republican caucus. And we, on our side of the aisle, will continue to fight as strongly as we can for the Dreamers in the weeks ahead. I say to all Americans, urge your senators to vote yes on the bipartisan compromise when it comes forward. Write, tweet, email, phone, visit, do everything you can so we can finally pass this bill. In a few hours, the government will reopen. We have a lot to do. The issue of the Dreamers demands resolution. A budget must be written. Health care has to be addressed. Relief provided to disaster-stricken parts of our country. Pensions and opioids, veterans, child care, all have to be taken care of.
Over the issue of illegal immigration is something the American people didn't understand and would not have understood in the future. So I'm glad we've gotten past that, and we have a chance now to get back to work.
The Senate to hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to concur with a further amendment in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 195, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 195 with a further amendment shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President, before we call the roll, I ask unanimous consent that the Democratic whip be allowed to address the chamber for 3 minutes with the gracious approval of the majority leader.
Is there objection? Without objection.
leadership from the start. And let me thank my colleagues. So many of you cast a vote that was very hard and very difficult because you believed, as I did, that the issue of immigration, the issue of the Dreamers, is the civil rights issue of our time. You stuck your necks out and said, I'm willing to go on record even if it's going to be hard to explain back home, and I will never forget that. The question now is how we move forward. What I have seen here on the floor of the Senate in the last few days is something impact on this debate so that we can move forward. I cannot tell my colleagues how many have come up to me from the other side of the aisle and said, we're with you on this issue. We want to help you get this done. Each of them has a little different take on what that means, but I do believe them. And I do believe we have this opportunity to move together. Now comes the test. We have to stand together. My last word is this. We have gathered the largest bipartisan group of senators to ever commit to moving forward on the DREAM Act and immigration. We have a process debate on the floor of the Senate on the DREAM Act and immigration. To all the Dreamers who are watching today, don't give up. I know that your lives are hanging in the balance on what we do here on Capitol Hill and with the White House. 3 weeks from now, I hope to be joining you in celebrating the passage with you and your families and your communities of a measure
Gotcha. Mr. Booker. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Thank you. Mr. Carper. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Daines. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Thank you. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, McCain. Sir. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Bennett, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Cochran, Nelson, Perdue, Peters, Portman, Reed, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Grassley, Merkley, Murphy, Paul, Sanders, Tester, and Warren. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Moran. Aye.
The motion is agreed to. Cloture having been invoked, the motion to refer falls.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, let me tell you how pleased I am, the people of Maryland, that we are now in the process of ending this government shutdown. The government shutdown does not benefit anyone. It certainly doesn't benefit the federal workers who live in Maryland and the federal workers around the nation. The uncertainty that a shutdown brings, those that are exempt upon governmental services, and it ends up costing taxpayers more money. So, Mr. President, I'm pleased to see that we're on path to end this shutdown, to get government back up and a path forward. I also am pleased that we've at least accelerated by 2 weeks the deadline for getting a budget done. Many of us have expressed major concern about continuing priorities. And that's what we should be doing every year. So in this case, the Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House. We would think that a budget could have been done by October 1, which is when the fiscal year began, October 1 of last year. We're now approaching 4 months under the FY18 budget, and we still don't have a budget. So one of the parts that I am pleased about as we move forward, we've had real, I think, positive discussions that by the February the 8th date, it's realistic to expect that we're going to be able to enact budget numbers so that the Appropriations Committee can recommend to the full chamber and we can pass appropriation bills or a cromnibus or an omnibus that will allow our agencies to have full-year appropriations, or I should say the remainder of this year's appropriations. And I certainly hope that will include FY19. That would certainly be the best. And that it will be balanced between the needs of the Department of Defense and the non-defense agencies. We have critical functions that require to have a full year of appropriations for, including our national defense, Department of Defense, our State Department, the Department of Health, and the work that's done in National Institutes of Health, food safety, and the Federal Drug Administration, the ability of the Social Security that we are committed to bringing out a budget by February the 8th so that we can give that type of predictability to the people of this country. That was one of the principal frustrations that many of us didn't want to go for another continuing resolution without knowing how we're going to deal with the budget. There are some special needs that we've had particular attention to that we really also need to get done by no later than February the 8th. One of that is the opioid funding. Opioid funding, clearly, it's in our national interest to recognize that we have a national crisis. Every community in the country is suffering from the opioid crisis, and we need to make sure that we give the wherewithal for the federal government to be a strong partner in dealing with this crisis. Many of my colleagues have talked about disaster relief. We certainly need to give help to the communities of Texas and Florida it was permanent, rather than putting another deadline on the program. We should try to make this permanent. It's been bipartisan success program in all of our states, and the Children's Health Insurance Program needs further attention for permanency. However, the legislation that we're in the process of passing does not deal with community health centers. We know that most of our children, parents that are using the CHIP program are going to be using health centers. We need to extend the programs for our health centers. There are a lot of extenders out there, Mr. President, we need to act on. Just to mention one, the one that I've been interested in and have authored legislation deals with the therapy caps. Therapy caps mean that those who have the most serious needs for therapy services, those suffering from stroke, those type of injuries, are not able to get the full services, or at least threatened not able to get the full services because of a therapy cap. We've extended it ever since we put it into law. It should never have been put into law, the caps, but we also need to pay attention to it in this budget debate, and that also needs to be dealt with by February the 8th. My colleagues, we've brought up the serious pension issues that affect the workers in this country. That needs to be addressed. So there's reason to say that I'm pleased that the government's back up, or will be back up shortly, but we really need to negotiate and not operate under continuing resolutions. I think the amount of spotlight that's been put on these issues, we have a much better chance to get to these budget issues resolved through appropriations or a cromnibus or an omnibus rather than another continuing resolution. And then, Mr. President, there is the issue of the Dreamers that I have talked about numerous times on the floor of the United States Senate. The Dreamer issue is urgent. It's urgent. Many Dreamers' lives have already been affected and their lives have been changed as a result of President Trump's announcement last September, putting a 6-month time limit on when the Dreamers would be subject to deportation. That deadline occurs early March, but in the meantime, those that are up for renewal of status, there's been uncertainty as to whether they will be able to continue to reside here in America, that they'll be able to continue to have a driver's license or work. They feel like they have, and they do have, a date on the back of their body saying that they expire on a particular date. That anxiety needs to end. It should never have been started under President Trump's edict in September, but we need to respond to that in an urgent way. So I was very pleased that we have a commitment from the majority leader that by no later than February the 8th, if we have not passed the bipartisan DACA protection, Dreamer protection bill, that we will have that bill on the floor of the United States Senate in a manner in which the majority, that the Senate can speak. And I'm very confident that the compromise that have been negotiated with Senator Graham and Senator Durbin, we will be able to pass that bill that would protect the Dreamers. Yes, it does. What it does is it allows the Dreamer status to maintain and puts them in a pathway so they can have permanent citizenship here in the United States, and they know that their future is America. After all, it's the only country that most know. So that is certainly a very encouraging sign. I was also very pleased to hear in the negotiations that took place that legislation would also provide the protection for those that are here in temporary protective status. President Trump, in some of the cases, has extended dates and said this is the last extension that could expire within the next 18 months. In some cases, he's deferred making that decision for some countries. What we know about those in temporary protective status, they're very similar to the Dreamers. That many know no country but the United States as their home, and it's important that we protect their status here in the United States. That are being used against the immigrant community is mindful of the efforts being made here to provide them a permanent status. and that the priorities on enforcement that we've heard mentioned many times, which quite frankly are very confusing to the immigrant community, that those priorities would not aim at those that are going to be protected under the legislation that we will be considering in the next few weeks. So, Mr. President, we all are pleased that we are now able to move forward to keep government open, that we have a commitment to deal with the budget of our country by February the 8th and the Dreamer issue by that date, that we've made real progress. As Senator Durbin observed, I think the members of this body want to return to the great traditions of the United States Senate, where we listen to each other, where we work together, where we compromise, and we're able to come to successful completion of our work. Too much work virtually no work has been done, but too much is on the table right now that needs to get finished. And let us take advantage of these next few weeks to show the American people that indeed we will work together in the best interest of our country, putting partisan politics aside, dealing with our budget issues, dealing with our immigration issues, dealing with our health care issues, dealing with our pension issues. We can do the people's work. Let's get that done, and let's start right now in getting that work completed. With that, Mr. President, I would suggest the absence.
President. Senator from North Carolina.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the United States Senate has just done the right thing. And in a matter of hours, hopefully, the decision to fund the government, to put people back to work, will find its way to the House of Representatives, and I'm sure that there it will find a quick agreement. And tomorrow, everybody will be back in place, and both the House and the Senate can work aggressively between now and February the 8th to make sure that this doesn't happen again and that we bring permanency and certainty to the funding. Mr. President, the Vice Chairman of the Intelligence Committee and I were notified when the House CR appeared that there was language in it that was different than in the past. And the language is in Section 148 of the CR, and it's of concern to the Intelligence Committee. And let me just read the language. Section 148, funds appropriated by the Department of Defense Missile Defeat and Defense Enhancement Acts, Appropriation Acts of 2018, Division B of Public Law 115-96, may be obligated and expended notwithstanding Section 504 of the National Security Act of 1947. Now, the language is troublesome for the committee because it would authorize the intelligence community to spend funds notwithstanding the law that requires prior authorization by the Senate Intelligence Committee or by the House Intelligence Committee. Now, the Vice Chairman and I were on the floor, I think, last week, and we had a 65 to 34 vote to reauthorize the most significant intelligence tool to keep America safe. And in that debate, both Senator Warner and myself said to our opposition that we would do everything within the committee's power to make sure that we did aggressive, real-time oversight over the entire intelligence community. Sometimes that means that when we see that there might be something we're uncomfortable with, we alter the ability to access funds. In congressional terms, we call that fencing off money. But we utilize the tools as an authorizer to affect what, in fact, individuals within the intelligence community can choose to do. Now, when you take away Section 504, authorities that the committees have, for the next 3 weeks, we will have an inability to exercise, in our estimation, the tools that we might need to keep our commitment to 34 individuals that still voted against us, but more importantly to the American people, that we would do everything to make sure that our intelligence communities acted in a way that those educated and elected in this body saw fit. So, as a result, this language could erode the powers of the authorizing committee. Effectively, the intelligence community could expend funds as it sees fit without authorization bill in place and with no statutory direction indicating that an authorization bill for 2018 is forthcoming. Let me just say to my colleagues, a situation like this is untenable. We've worked with our colleagues in HPSI to develop language to change this. And I might say we've had a couple of opportunities to do it, and we should have done it literally when we changed the date of the CR. When we changed the date from the original date to the 8th of February, the 16th I think was the original, we should have inserted this new language. But because there's a fight between appropriators and the Intelligence Committee in the House, we weren't able to do that. And I have a feeling that Senator Warner and I are going to find that there's now a fight between the Intelligence Committees and the appropriators in the United States Senate. because I fear somebody might object to the unanimous consent. I will ask after Senator Warner speaks. But let me read for you, Mr. President, what the committee has come up with. And this is bicameral. The House Select Committee on Intelligence is in agreement that in Section 148, it would say funds appropriated by the Defense, Missile, Defeat, and Defense Enhancement Act, Appropriation Act of 2018, Division of Public Law 11596, for intelligence or intelligence-related activities are deemed specifically authorized by Congress for the purposes of Section 504 of the National Security Act of 1947, 50 U.S. Code 414, during fiscal year 2018 until the enactment of the Intelligence Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018. Vice Chairman's a lawyer. I'm not. I really rely on the legal counsel that we have within the committee to interpret U.S. law. It really doesn't take a law degree to understand that there's a huge difference between ignoring Section 504, notwithstanding, or applying Section 504, which our change makes. So this isn't really a misinterpretation. This is a question of whether you want to take Section 504 of the National Security Act of 1947, 50 U.S. Code 414, and continue to let it apply, or whether you're going to provide the intelligence community a waiver that exempts them from having to adhere to part of U.S. code. And the reason that I wanted the opportunity to speak before we ask unanimous consent was I want my colleagues to understand we take our oversight role extremely serious. We want every tool in our basket that we can to give the American people the assurance that we know exactly what's going on and that we are at least in agreement that they proceed forward, not that they have a free rein only because they've been appropriated a pot of money because an executive request was made. It would be no different under the Obama administration or under the Trump administration. And I would encourage my colleagues not to object to it when I ask for the unanimous consent, because that's what we're here for. With that, I would yield to the Vice Chairman.
Mr. President. Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I want to echo a number of the comments that my friend, the Chairman, the Senator from North Carolina made. 10 days ago, we asked for reauthorization of Section 702, and I came to this floor and advocated that this was a critically important tool. That part of the reforms of that legislation would even give us more insight into how that tool was used. But we said at that point, not only to those members who didn't agree with us on that, but to all of the members, and for that matter, the American people, that the Intelligence Committee would continue its vigorous oversight of that program and other programs. Being on the Intelligence Committee, at least until recently, has not been necessarily all that high attention and profile. We spend hundreds and hundreds of hours every month in a SCIF. And one of the things that I find so rewarding about the Intelligence Committee's work is on issue after issue, you couldn't tell who's a Democrat and Republican. We all take extraordinarily serious our oversight responsibilities. If this exemption is granted, you could potentially have an administration, any administration, go off and take on covert activities, for example, with no ability for our committee, which spends the time and has the oversight, to say time out, or to say we actually disagree with that policy. So I've been very disturbed about the whole process that arose in the House, how this attempted to get slipped in. I hope, as well as the chairman, that no member would choose to object. And if they do choose to object, I hope they will be able to explain to the American public why they would want to remove the Intelligence Committee's ability to monitor, and then if we make a decision, withdraw funds if we don't agree, and have that ongoing tool that's one of the most key components of our oversight responsibility, why they would want to, in effect, give any administration, for that matter, a blank check. So again, my hope will be that no one will object to this request, that we will continue the policies that existed for as long as I've been on the committee, and that those of us on that committee will continue to take the responsibility of oversight very, very seriously, and will continue to do it in a bipartisan way. With that, I'll yield back to the chairman.
I thank the vice chairman of the committee. Mr. President, there are over 30-plus professional staffers that staff both sides of the Intelligence Committee. On each side, there's a staffer designated for each of the intelligence agencies in this country. And I would dare say today that they know their particular portfolio of intelligence agencies as well as the employees that work inside that agency. They're experts. They're tasked with that degree of knowledge. And layered on top of that are 15 members of the United States Senate that the leadership on both sides have asked to spend countless hours behind closed doors, as the vice chairman said, typically in a bipartisan fashion, to provide for every member and for the American people our certification that we agree with what the intelligence community is doing, that it lives within the letter of the law, that there is some congressional oversight on a constant basis in real time, assuring members and the American people of that accuracy. Why would you take away the tools that we have to actually hold them accountable? And I know that appropriators believe that this hinders their ability to spend money when we're in a continuing resolution period because of Section 504. I'm not sure that I interpret it the same way that they do. Just because an executive branch has asked for a pot of money, I've never considered that the committee couldn't go in because of a vehement disagreement with the way some of it's being spent and alter that. That altering means that on the part of 15 members, we have a hesitancy as to how it's being done. Neuter the committee, you neuter our oversight. So at this time, I would ask unanimous consent that the Burr Amendment to the amendment number 1917, which is at the desk, be considered and agreed to.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Mississippi.
I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, it's my hope that we will come to our senses at some point in this process, and that this waiver to U.S. code will in fact not be in place. But I will assure on behalf of the Vice Chairman and myself to all our members, we will do the best to our ability, given the limitation that's placed on us, to hold the intelligence community accountable for everything that they do, and that we will be much more active in the future relative to the appropriations that find their way there, if in fact they're not going to provide us the tools to manage in a constructive way those things that the agencies choose to carry out. If I didn't have the number of individuals in members and in staff that are experts, I probably wouldn't be as confident. But these folks take it extremely serious because we know what's at stake. The trust that we have with our members and the trust we have with the American people. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I politely yield back, but with great disappointment.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.